do you think there would be enough money in the universe to make a person like Gina Rinehart feel secure?
I mean, billionaires have extraordinary political power, and in watching Gina Rinehart exercise that power is a formidable thing.
Over the past 6 episodes, we've spent a lot of time talking about Gina Rinehart's past, her upbringing, and how her and her family have moved through the country and the world, how they've changed it for the better and for the worse. We've heard from her supporters and her detractors, her friends and her family. We heard about how her family are said to have started the iron ore industry in Australia, her family legal sagas and her support of Australian athletes. But in this episode, we turn to what Gina and her company, Hancock Prospecting, are doing now.
It's quite incredible to watch a billionaire at work. I mean, they have more resources than other people. They have more access to political power than other people. And they use all of these tools.
They're just trying to be their best industrial selves. Everybody else is getting in their way. I can see why that narrative would be appealing to somebody like Gina Rinehart.
From Guardian Australia, I'm Sarah Martin, and this is Gina, a podcast series about Australia's richest person.
It's sad, but we've seen this story before. I mean, this is Citizen Kane. There are figures from Homer. You know, you can change the uniforms, you can change the time stamp. This is an ancient story.
This is episode 7. What does Gina want?
Grassy Mountain is a very prominent mountain in the Crow's Nest Pass. You can see it as you drive through the region. It's a beautiful mountain. It is scarred from old mining activities, but it's still an intact mountain. Still got functioning forests and grasslands. There are grizzly bears, there are elk, there are deer, there are cougars. There's a lot of wildlife in these mountains.
How often do you see a grizzly bear, Andrew?
Probably about once a year. I saw 3 this year, 3 of them together. Fortunately for us, they just decided to take off. So,
Andrew Nikiforuk is a Canadian journalist from the province of Alberta.
And I work for a well-known Canadian publication called The Tyee.
Does that name mean anything?
Yes, it means big fish.
Ah, okay.
It's referring to a Chinook salmon.
He lives not far away from Grassy Mountain.
Open prairie, butting up against a very dramatic mountain landscape known as the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains, like sawtooths in the sky.
I'm talking to Andrew because of something that happened in November of 2024, right in his backyard.
November in the Crow's Nest Pass is usually snowy.
So it's a freezing cold day in the Rockies, when on the 25th of November, residents of the small municipality of Crow's Nest Pass are asked to vote on something.
The referendum basically asked 1,500 people in the Crow's Nest Pass whether or not they supported a coal mine.
Do you support the development and operations of the metallurgical coal mine at Grassy Mountain?
The Grassy Mountain project would essentially produce 4.5 million tons of coal a year over a 28-year period. The project is also located in a critical watershed that feeds the Oldman River, which is the major water source for southern Alberta and its agricultural economy.
And the owner of this project is a company called Northback Holdings. Is the narrative of a foreign coal baron part of the picture?
It is and it isn't. What I find very interesting is that most of the Canadian media does not mention that Northback Holding is owned by Gina Rinehart.
Northback Holdings is a fully owned and operated subsidiary of Hancock Prospecting, and Grassy Mountain is Gina's attempt to expand into the Canadian coal industry. But how did Gina end up getting involved in the politics of mining in the Rockies in the first place?
Well, there's a long history of coal mining. A number of foreign companies came to the Crow's Nest Pass region about 100 years ago, but the industry largely disappeared by around 1980 for a number of reasons. Alberta, per se, as a province, is a bit like Western Australia. This is a province that depends a lot on resource development, particularly oil and gas. In many ways, we're very much a petro state. None of the money stayed in the pass. It all went to the foreign owners of the coal mines. So the region has been dealing with the legacy of coal mines, which is pollution, a number of social issues and problems, poverty, not as many jobs or well-paying jobs in the past. So that was the state of the Crow's Nest Pass when Gina Rinehart arrived with her proposal for a new mine site with the promise of well-paying jobs.
In 2019, Gina Rinehart and Hancock Prospecting take over a Canadian coal mining operation called Benga Mining, the same year that the state of Alberta elects a new Conservative Premier. But at this time, Alberta has a strict policy in place, which among other things prevents open-cut coal mining in parts of the Rockies, going back to 1976. After lobbying from the coal industry, the new government overturns these restrictions, paving the way for the Grassy Mountain project to proceed unfettered. This leads to a massive backlash, and in the wake of that, a moratorium on new coal projects is put in place, while the government comes up with a revised policy. But the Grassy Mountain mine is still on the table and goes to the regulator for approval.
In 2021, provincial and federal regulators rejected the project for a number of reasons. They said, first of all, they weren't convinced of the economic argument that there would be some real benefit to the local community. They said this was highly questionable. They were extremely concerned about selenium pollution from the mine. And they were also concerned about a number of other critical environmental issues. And for all of those reasons, they said, look, this project really doesn't make any sense. And the harm would be much greater than any alleged economic benefit.
And why were Australian coal speculators so keen to buy leases in the Rockies?
Well, I mean, for them, it was a great deal in the sense that the Alberta government charges only 1% royalties on coal, while most Australian state governments are charging around 7%. So that's a bargain. Plus, the Alberta government had made a number of promises. They said, look, we're going to reduce our regulations. We're going to make it easier for you to get things approved in this province. And for those reasons, the Australians thought that, wow, okay, this sounds like a very friendly jurisdiction. Let's go for it.
The project is declared dead, but almost immediately after being knocked back by the regulator, the company launches legal action. Its challenge fails, but even this does nothing to kill Gina's drive to get Grassy Mountain up and running.
Gina Rinehart has spent millions contesting the regulatory decision, saying no to her in the courts, and lost 3 times. So what did she do next? Well, she started a new company.
Gina renames the company Northback Holdings and makes a new application, testing the government's moratorium.
Then what did she do? She hired a new executive. She gave him a new mandate to resurrect this mine. And then she lobbied the Alberta government like mad.
In December 2023, Northback and 4 other Australian coal companies sue the Albertan government for more than $10 billion over alleged losses due to the renewed moratorium. But by this time, the company has found a powerful ally in the new Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith. Smith, during her campaign to become the new Conservative leader, had made a suggestion.
It was an absolutely bizarre kind of scenario. So the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, who's very much a right-wing ideologue, said, you know what? We know people are opposed to this mine, but if the locals vote in favor of it in a referendum, then the government might change its tack on coal mining in the Rockies.
The Crow's Nest Pass Council hears this and decides that they'd be happy to hold a referendum. But Andrew says that he never had any doubt about which way that vote was going to go.
And almost everyone could guess what the outcome would be. 72% of the population voted in favor of this mine. I don't blame the people of Crow's Nest Pass. I mean, nobody's giving them another choice. The vote was only presented as, look, jobs and prosperity. Oh, so what's the opposite? No jobs and despair? Northback Holdings has been working on the community for a long time, and they've used very traditional ways of essentially buying the vote and buying public opinion. So one way they did this was by contributing $70,000 to a school nutrition program so that they can then say, look, we're supporting or alleviating poverty in this region by supporting this school program. This is very much a political setup to purchase a social license for a project that literally has no social license. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on the referendum. They had campaign signs, they had billboards, they had an active program in the media, particularly the right-wing media, because a lot of people in the Crow's Nest Pass only listen to certain news outlets.
Northpack Holdings even offered a lift to voters to get them to the polling stations.
So it had snowed heavily prior to the vote. It actually was literally difficult for some people to get to the polls because of the amount of snow. I mean, this is incredible. Here's an Australian company, a foreign company in Canada, offering to drive people to the polls, over whether or not you support a project that is being advocated by this company. Extraordinary.
But Andrew also says the other thing he takes issue with is that the residents of Crow's Nest Pass aren't even voting on a mine in Crow's Nest Pass because the Grassy Mountain mine is actually next door in a municipal district, or MD, called Ranchland.
The MD of Ranchland is 100% opposed to putting a mining project in the headwaters of the Oldman River. Meanwhile, the MD of Crow's Nest Pass is an old coal mining town where the only part of the project that is located in that MD would basically be the offloading for the train. That's it. The other problem with the referendum was that it also ignores the fact that there are 200,000 people downstream of this project that depend on water from the Oldman River. And they are now wondering and asking, why is it a very small group of people in one MD where the project will not be located can have a say on whether or not this project is going to be built?
The referendum was non-binding, but the council said that in the event of a yes vote, it would lobby provincial and federal authorities to get the mine approved.
Has the intensity of her efforts surprised you? Have you seen anything like this before in Alberta?
I've seen oil and gas companies conduct similar campaigns, but not so brazenly as this on a project that's not even located in that locality. I've never seen that before. I mean, that to me has got to be one of the most distasteful things I've seen happen in a democracy in a long time.
When it released the results, the council said the referendum was about, quote, clearly understanding what the community wants on the Grassy Mountain project. We are not the decision maker on this mine, and we are only one of the stakeholders, but we are an important one. We are the community that this mine primarily will draw from for housing, road, rail, and the workforce. A spokesperson for Hancock Prospecting also said in respect of the referendum, quote,
The Local Authorities Elections Act governed Northback's participation in the Crow's Nest pass vote and how all parties conducted themselves during the above-mentioned vote. Northback complied with this legislation and all other applicable laws.
The referendum is held in November.
Thanks everybody for coming out today. It's a big day for Alberta and our resource sector. It's a big day for them too, and so I'm going to get right into it. It's important.
In December, the Albertan government announces they're changing the law to be more favourable to coal developments in the province.
We're bringing coal development in Alberta from the 19th century to the 21st century. This action addresses the 2021 Coal Policy Committee's recommendations to build a long-term legislative and regulatory framework to guide responsible coal development across our great province. As part of this coal modernization initiative, we will be substantially increasing coal royalties.
And in January 2025...
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be here with Nathan Neudorf, Minister of Affordability and Utilities and Parliamentary Secretary.
Premier Danielle Smith lifts the ban on coal projects.
To announce the end of the Alberta Utility Commission's pause on approvals tomorrow and the direction Alberta will take to ensure that we have affordable and reliable electricity. Alberta is Canada's leader in renewable energy. In fact, as much as 92%.
She cites the multi-billion-dollar lawsuit against the government brought by Gina Rinehart and others as among the reasons why.
The state's regulator will soon decide whether to approve Northback Holdings' new drilling exploration application for the Grassy Mountain project. It's widely anticipated to get the go-ahead. Meanwhile, the Alberta government is consulting with industry on its new rules for coal. A spokesperson for Hancock Prospecting provided us with the following comment, which we've had read out by a voice actor.
Credible market forecasts and cost estimates indicate that the project could generate over $1 billion in economic value over its life through royalties, property taxes, income tax, and other fiscal contributions. The Crow's Nest pass vote, conducted on November 25, 2024, delivered a strong yes vote of 72%, and established unequivocally that there is an overwhelming level of local support to develop the Grassy Mountain steelmaking coal project.
So, I mean, billionaires have extraordinary political power, and in watching Gina Rinehart exercise that power in Alberta is a formidable thing. And of course, she is working with politicians who share a very similar ideology to hers, which is natural resource development can only be good. Climate change is highly questionable. Environmental activists are not to be trusted. High-paying jobs and prosperity will be the only product of open-pit mining that any citizen ever needs to concern themselves about. I mean, you see this happening all over the world at this point in time. I mean, you've got this great political realignment going on all over the world, and yeah, I mean, it's I'm at a loss for words.
What Andrew is describing here is Gina Rinehart's worldview. Deeply conservative values, hatred for green and red tape, a love of capitalism and development, and distrust of government interference. And we know that a lot of this came from Lang. But there's also another inspiration, one that Gina has publicly espoused as a guiding light, one that is having a moment around the world. And that all comes from a dystopian novel published in 1957.
It wasn't until you were 13 that you first discovered Ayn Rand.
Yes.
And was that Atlas Shrugged?
It was Atlas Shrugged.
Atlas Shrugged was written by Russian-American author Ayn Rand. It's a book that has seen a recent resurgence as a favourite of billionaires everywhere. Elon Musk is a fan. Donald Trump is too. Even celebrities like Brad Pitt. But to Gina Rinehart, it holds a special significance. She first got her hands on a copy when she was just a girl, and it changed her life.
values that were in that book, I haven't shied from ever since. I think they definitely helped to give me the certain values that I believe in. Yeah.
In 2024, she even received an award from the Atlas Society, an organisation which promotes the views of Ayn Rand. There is some really interesting stuff in this interview between Gina and the head of the society, called Jennifer Grossman. It's absolutely revelatory about Gina Rinehart's worldview.
To say that Mrs. Gina Rinehart is the perfect honoree for the Atlas Society's 2024 Lifetime Achievement Award is, if anything, an understatement in the extreme.
So Atlas Shrugged is basically a philosophical statement masquerading as a novel.
Dr. Alexander Howard is Senior Lecturer in the discipline of English and Writing at the University of Technology, Sydney. And I also have to confess that I haven't read Atlas Shrugged. It's been on the to-do list, but then I found out it was 1,200 pages, and I have 3 small children, and we're basically talking to you, so we don't have to read Atlas Shrugged.
I think that's the best way to be, because it's a bad book. It's a bad book, and it's 1,200 pages long, and look, she's a terrible writer. She writes in a very didactic fashion. She's polemical. She's basically writing her philosophy and spelling it out ad nauseum. But what's been interesting to me, she sells millions of copies of books. It's like 37 million or something at last count. And I am infinitely curious as to why.
For the uninitiated, can you tell us what the main sort of ideological themes are?
The theoretical philosophical system that's advanced in Atlas Shrugged is this idea of objectivism. Now, she defines that as this: my philosophy, in essence, is the concept of man as a heroic being, with his own happiness as the moral purpose of his life, with productive achievement as his noblest activity, and reason as his only absolute. She advocates for what she terms the virtue of selfishness. She defines selfishness in a particular way, and that is as a concept of rational self-interest. So in an ideal society, everybody is pursuing, quote unquote, this rational self-interest, and we can all live in harmony. Rand really deals in black and white. There is no ambiguity in her writing. She's implacably opposed to anything that smacks of collectivism or socialism, or as she calls it, altruism. Altruism, I think she describes it at one point as this cannibalistic activity. We should not be looking to offer our assistance to our fellow beings because it might damage our pursuit of our rational self-interest.
And so in this world where everyone is acting in their own rational self-interest, what outcome does this lead to?
Atlas Shrugged is a dystopia. A world that's becoming increasingly socialist in the States, beset by economic depression. We've got the heroic titans, captains of industry, trying their best to make things work, but they're surrounded by what she'll call looters or moochers or second-handers, who, under the guise of altruism, keep pulling resources from those titans and basically crashing the economy in the pursuit of the common good. So I think, are we going to spoil the plot of Atlas Shrugged for everybody? Because again, it's a long book.
Please do.
So the plot of the novel is effectively, there's a guy called John Galt, who's the hero of the novel. The famous line is, "Who is John Galt?" You could look up some images, I'm sure, of libertarian rallies, and you might see people holding placards saying, "Who is John Galt?" At the start of the novel, we don't really know who he is. He turns out to be an inventor who devised a stable form of usable electricity which would effectively solve all of the world's energy problems. But he's working for a corporation who are engaged in, I'm using Randian terms here, corrupt activity. So he decides to withdraw his labour and his invention. The world can't have it because they're not good enough to have it. And so what he's doing, and it only becomes clear over the course of the novel, is encouraging the men of the mind, the titans of industry, to join him and withdraw their labour because they're not really understood or they don't get their due. And by doing so, effectively, they'll bring about the end of civilization. And at that point, having demonstrated to everybody else that they're not worthy, at that point, they'll leave the private island, Galt's Gorge, they inhabit, which is this hidden realm. It reminds me a bit of Fitzgerald's Diamond as Big as the Ritz. It's not a utopian space. She insisted on this. It's a private property. At that point, once everything's burnt to the ground, effectively, they can come back and start again. There you go. I've done it. I've done it in a few sentences.
So in writing Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand said she, quote, set out to show the world how desperately it needs prime movers and how viciously it treats them. Mm-hmm. Given how viciously and relentlessly the Australian mining industry and you personally are maligned by the press, environmental activists, etc., have you ever fantasized about going Galt, about just shrugging and leaving the detractors to their own devices?
Various government policies have basically forced people to take that route in our country.
In that interview, Gina's life is also compared to characters from the book.
Of course, all of you in the room know her story, growing up on a sheep and cattle farm in the remote and rugged region of Pilbara in northwest Australia. She is Dagny Taggart and Francisco D'Anconia, rolled into one and then some.
Can you tell us about these characters, Dagny Taggart and Francisco D'Anconia?
Sarah, this is great. I never thought I'd be doing this. Okay, Dagny Taggart, one of the leaders of Taggart Transcontinental, a rail network in America, under severe economic pressure at the start of the novel, because the company is subject to increasing levels of regulation that Dagny desperately fights against.
Now, obviously, Gina says she inherited a failing company and led it to success despite sort of opposition from government and all these bureaucrats holding them back and stymieing their efforts. Does that sound thematically similar to what's going on in Atlas Shrugged?
It does. It absolutely does. And Dagny is in a way quite naive. She wants to make her company work. She's trying to do the right thing continually. And the right thing is you make better trains, make transport more efficient. But she's fighting a losing battle against the bureaucracy. So yes, I think that would be the thematic similarity there. Francisco D'Anconia knows Dagny from youth, romantic interest. He's the head of D'Anconia Copper, another huge corporation. When we meet him as an adult, he's portrayed at first as a playboy, a frivolous playboy. Makes me think of Christian Bale in the Dark Knight trilogy or the Nolan films, squandering his wealth, behaving badly. Nobody knows why he's doing this. It turns out that he's working at the behest of John Galt to basically sabotage his own company, to drain all of the stocks, all the reserves, so nobody else can have it. Again, tanking everything so they can start afresh. These two massive industrial figures, they're just trying to be their best industrial selves. Everybody else is getting in their way. I can see why that narrative would be appealing to somebody like Gina Rinehart. Actually thinking about the Atlas Society and that the interview she does, Rinehart is really explicit about the fact that there's so much red tape surrounding mining. We need to get rid of that in order to make Australia great.
We are the engine room of this country, our mining industry. It creates more revenue than every single other industry added together, to give you a bit of perspective. And what they don't understand with their legislation, their rules and regulations, is that you've got to keep opening new mines. Once you've mined one out, it doesn't fall from the sky and replenish itself. You've actually got to open new mines or even mine extensions to be able to keep this beautiful revenue stream going. And this is the bit that they just don't get. What they do has consequences. I mean, it's taking us about 17 years now to get a mine developed in Australia. It is
17
approximately 17 years. It is just so much government tape.
I could see that as a 13-year-old in the family professional environment that she exists in, how something like Atlas Shrugged could well strike a chord that resonates. Seeing a father figure who's trying to make it work, who's trying to, raise Australia up. This is the kind of rhetoric that Rinehart herself uses. That, yes, again, resonates clearly with Dagny. She struggles and she cannot understand why people are placing roadblocks in the way of what we would call in this context progress. So absolutely, I think if you're in that kind of environment, when you are thinking about prospecting, a term that she uses a lot as well, it would make logical sense that this book could have great appeal. And it's confirmation bias in a way.
And in an example of art mirroring life, the parallels don't stop there. Because when Ayn Rand was researching Atlas Shrugged, she visited the US company Kaiser Steel several times in 1947 to observe the inner workings of its operation. And a large part of Atlas Shrugged occurs at a location clearly inspired by those visits. It's called Reardon Steel. And you might remember from episode 2, those American steel executives who visited the Pilbara, the ones that Gina's dad flew out to see the iron ore in the 60s, they were from Kaiser Steel.
Kaisers came in, and when they came in, the banks came in, and when the banks came in, the thing started to roll.
And the vice president of Kaiser Steel, his name was Tom Price, the namesake of Mount Tom Price, the mine that started it all. Small world, huh? There was one line in that interview with Grossman that I found really fascinating where Gina says,
I only do this as a part-time thing. I would like to thank your organisation because you are doing this full-time.
And I was like, what is this? What does she do part-time?
Well, my reading of that, I only advocate for these ideas on occasion, whereas they really are championing Rand's work for the betterment of, quote unquote, the betterment of society. And they're doing it consistently. They're pushing a product and they're pushing a worldview forward. And Rinehart is quite explicit there in that moment, isn't it? She's praising them for doing it. You're doing the hard work. And actually, I forgot about this. One of the things that Rand insists on, you fight the wars with ideas. You're not going to affect political change instantaneously. So she frames everything in terms of effectively what I would call a culture war. And she does it specifically in relation to universities, which she says are polluting, corrupting the American mind. And it's interesting in that Atlas Society interview that Rinehart, she doesn't call out the universities specifically, but she calls out education.
Our curriculum at our schools, it is lowering the areas of rationale and logic. It is a lot more on propaganda. Probably close to a third of our curriculum, if not more, is woke. It is anti-Australia. It is climate change, those sorts of areas. And I think our students are missing out.
I'm also really interested in Rand's philosophy in regards to the environment and sort of human beings being the higher order species. Can you give us an overview of her views on the environment and sustainability?
So, yes, man is a human is the primary subject of her writing. There's the absolute hierarchy there. She hated the environmental movement of the 60s and 70s and has nothing good to say about it whatsoever. Basically accuses those in that movement of pulling the wool over people's eyes to advance a cause of altruism, which will invariably have negative impacts on industry. She does that at the same time as pulling that old card out of, well, the scientists say this, but there might be one scientist who says this other thing. We need to get to grips with the evidence first before we can make a decision. And she's absolutely suspicious and hostile towards it throughout, consistently.
You know, they love to talk about sustainable this and sustainable that.
I don't like that word sustainable.
But, you know, I think we should think about applying it to what is sustainable for businesses.
There's this other thing going on in that video of the Atlas Society interviewing Gina. Jennifer Grossman is wearing this incredible brooch. It's enormous. A giant gold dollar sign just emblazoned on her chest. I just wanted you to explain the dollar sign brooch.
Oh, yeah.
How is capitalism part of this view of the world?
Yeah, so that's a riff on a symbol from Atlas Shrugged. But it's the dollar sign as natural and exalted way of being. The best way of existing is in a capitalist society, and that's what we should be doing. So everything's, if you like, in service to the dollar.
Gina's love of this book gives us an insight into her values and the theoretical underpinnings of her worldview. John Hancock, Gina's son, has seen this play out in real life. I wanted to pick up the sort of wealth and power and how you've witnessed her use her wealth and power. You've obviously observed her from a very young age. What have you observed?
Look, I think if she didn't have an intellectual argument about something, just sheer wealth wouldn't achieve, say, the political inroads that she has. She's always been interested in, probably from Lang, the right side of politics. She's definitely got not just wealth and power on her side, I suppose. Obviously, she has access, so she can put her case to whoever she wants, and no one's not going to pick up her call. She can put forth her view in a much louder way than other people.
So she uses her wealth and power to get the access to put forward her view.
Well, the political side would be wanting, it's a mutual thing. So, of course, they would want her views. I mean, she's a massive employer. She knows the industry that is generating the most tax revenue for the country. It's rightful that she should be having, and the government should be listening to her.
Obviously, we've seen her very much on board the Trump train in the US, has been for quite some time, even before he was president, round one. What do you think she sees in Trump?
Well, it actually goes back a lot further than Trump. I remember as a kid when we lived in Houston, she worked on the Women for Reagan movement, which was Reagan at that point had a image problem among women, apparently, and wanted more of the female vote. So there was, I think that was 84. And it was a very exciting time. I saw George Bush Sr. as the vice president candidate make a speech, and we were meeting some senators, and these are very magnetic people. When you meet them in person, it's quite a thrill. And the American political machine is a lot more exciting than the Australian one. She loves that excitement. I think that's she gets a thrill out of it. So it's very similar to Reagan. He's a strong leader, forceful, all the things that Gina likes, and prepared to take on those perceived problems, excessive government spending, all that sort of thing.
And Gina's been very vocal in wanting to see a similar movement in Australia. What do you make of that push?
I just think she's saying the same things as she's been saying for decades. The message hasn't changed. It's just getting more runway.
But is the end game power in and of itself, or is it she wants to pay less tax, or she wants, less red tape for her own commercial interests?
I think that she firmly believes that bigger business, the ease of doing business attracts more business, and the whole thing snowballs to employ more people, higher salaries, profits for shareholders, and for public companies that means wide groups of shareholders that hopefully start buying shares in the companies they work for. And that is a model that she really believes in. Is she doing it for notoriety or power for the sake of power? I think that's a means to an end. For her own self-benefit, well, yes, of course, part of that is self-benefit. But that is the capitalistic viewpoint, Adam Smith's invisible hand. Markets and your self-motivation to benefit yourself, or you have to go out and work, or you have to start a business. So it's all part of the same thing. And I think that's a system, out of all the different systems, for better or worse, that's the only one that's proven to work. Saying that, should there be some level of regulation over the conduct of businesses, I agree with that as well. How when something isn't overseen and someone does have unlimited power, they can then do things that they probably shouldn't. So it's a hard one.
There have been many articles written about Gina and her family over the years. And throughout the process of making this series, trust me when I say I have read a lot of them, multiple times. One that stood out to me in particular was published in The New Yorker in 2013. It's by a guy called William Finnegan, and it's called The Miner's Daughter. And in it, there's a quote that for me really jumped off the page. It was a quote from Tim Winton, the West Australian novelist and one of Australia's most high-profile environmental campaigners. He's also one of my favourite authors. And it's the only quote from him in the piece. Just a fragment. 4 words. He says that Gina's childhood seemed to be a, quote, science experiment inside a, quote, regal bubble. And I thought, Tim Winton surely has a lot more than 4 words to say about Gina Rinehart. He's grown up in Western Australia with the mythical story of Lang Hancock and everything he has done for the state. And in the Pilbara, I'd read his apocalyptic climate change novel Juice, which seemed relevant. And so I relentlessly bugged him until he sat down with me.
recording now?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Tim Winton. My occupation was once author. God knows what it is now. Because I never get to write anything anymore as I'm talking into a microphone.
Who am I?
Yeah, sorry.
I'm Sarah.
Okay.
You know who I
know we need plausible deniability when I send the injunction.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Sarah Martin, journalist at The Guardian. You're talking to me on the record with under no duress.
Correct, in all particulars.
Throughout this series, we've heard numerous people reflect on Gina's political views and ambitions. And we've heard Gina herself talk about the desire to cut so-called green and red tape to allow business to unleash its commercial potential. And this is where Gina's ambitions meet fierce opposition from Australia's environmental campaigners, who are advocating for urgent climate action and regulation to protect the natural environment from mining activities. Okay, so I guess as an opening question, I wanted to ask you what it's like being an environmental activist in a petro state.
Yeah, fair question. I mean, I don't think most Australians really understand, the information state that we live in, because there's essentially a monopoly on news information. To be an artist or an activist, and particularly a social justice or an environmental activist in Western Australia, is really to be engaged, whether you like it or not, in resistance. It's regardless of your politics, however, whatever kind of version of activist you are, absolutely up against it.
Tim and I are talking in March, not long after the Labor government abandoned plans to establish a federal environmental protection agency, which was promised to be established under a suite of new protections called the Nature Positive Reforms. It was a captain's call to shelve it by the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and came after fierce lobbying from the resources sector in WA, including Hancock Prospecting. The West Australian had labelled federal Labor enemies of the state for proposing the legislation and had campaigned relentlessly against it. The Nightly, an online paper also owned by Kerry Stokes and partly bankrolled by Gina, called it green zealotry. Albanese called off the deal in February after speaking on the phone with the WA Labor Premier, Roger Cook. Both were up for re-election. The miners rejoiced.
And they bragged about that. For that to be summarily aborted because of the interests of one lobby, one tiny group of people. I think that shows you what's happening to our democracy, and I think we should be worried about that. And it's all very well for us to look at the tangerine clown who's now in power in the White House and look, at how crazy that circus has become, and for us to feel better because of our preferential voting system, our compulsory voting system. But even with those safeguards, our democracy is being perverted and the will of the people is being undercut. Because we know the polling in Western Australia in particular, a majority of people want action on climate change. And the fossil fuel lobby and their supporters in Parliament are making sure that that will is subverted, that nothing is done. And, I mean, that's not just interesting, that's an outrage.
Since doing this interview, the Australian electorate has returned Anthony Albanese's Labor government to power in a landslide election. An election that also saw Gina Rinehart's good friend and Liberal leader Peter Dutton lose his seat. But Tim says no party is immune to influence.
The more damaging and more frightening thing to me is the internalisation of that sector's narrative. I mean, you can hear premiers and prime ministers uttering talking points that you're quite familiar with. You know the dot points yourself, and then out they come. That's the success of infiltration. That's the success of persuasion and the corralling and the influence campaigning. Watching them, the expressions of fealty just get more fevered. I think it would be dangerous to be complacent about how far the pernicious and anti-democratic influence can and will go. I just like to think that Australians would eventually feel the fur ball and cough it, because it kind of makes you want to gag day after day when you're seeing, these increasingly shameless iterations of fealty and the ways in which people can be encouraged to vote against their own interests.
Great to be with you all for our National Day. Shouldn't we really have a national month or two, given our industry's contribution?
This leads us to talking about Gina co-opting a phrase coined by Donald Trump.
And don't you just love the saying, drill baby drill, essential for getting gas to supply homes and industry around Australia? Well, maybe it's just a little timid whisper out here in Australia now, as it's getting so darned hard to drill baby drill.
At her 2024 National Mining Day celebration, Gina wore a giant "Dig Baby Dig" placard and criticised the government.
And our government wants to see the end of the fossil fuel industry, your industry.
This is the thing. Dig Baby Dig is probably the most nihilistic private or public utterance that a person can make in our current situation. And to be saying that in public at a time when people of my children's age and my grandchildren's age are terrified about the future is to be almost like prematurely dancing on their graves. And I think very soon, I think these kinds of nihilistic slogans, these sort of slavish echoes of this sort of proto-fascist, Trump, will be seen to be what they are. They will be repellent, and they will be sources of shame and rage, particularly I'm just thinking about what my grandchildren's adulthood and middle age will be like,
I mean, it's interesting to me that we are seeing the reality of climate change now, that you can still have someone like Gina Rinehart, who has so much wealth and power, can be sort of ignoring this reality around. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
It is hard to get your head around, but then you have to look back to her personal history. I mean, she grew up in that bubble, that kind of iron dome of privilege. If you grow up in a bubble, they have no conception of an ordinary life. They have no conception of how they're perceived outside the bubble. Someone like Rinehart, sadly, is, not just thin-skinned and prodigiously litigious. She's also poorly educated in a formal education, but also in a social education. And it's sad to watch, the inability to read a room. And I think it's hard to grow past that. And it's evident, from watching her subsequent history, that she hasn't grown past that. She's not a very well-educated person. She's enormously influential. She has mobility that almost no other person has. But that hasn't resulted in her getting a broad education. It hasn't made her particularly literate. You can read her poems, you can find that out. And I think it's conceivable that the kinds of information that is readily available and that has been available for a generation, and in the last 5 years in particular, last 2 years specifically, is now so acute, so substantial and overwhelming that this is information that she probably can't contemplate because it threatens her entire way of seeing the world, how she's made her money, how she sees her future, who she's aligned with. And every success that Trump has had in recent months has emboldened her. You can see that. We have, an ever increasing gap between the super rich and the poor. And you can see that any day you like in the streets of Perth. You'll certainly see it in the Pilbara, where, the riches of Western Australia and Australia are being generated.
Why does Rinehart, she's sitting on a wealth of, astronomical wealth of $40 billion. She's the richest person in Australia. She's arguably one of the most powerful. Why does she need to control a narrative?
Well, I'm not a psychologist, but I have spent, my entire adult life observing people and writing about them and wondering about their inner workings and also just describing their behaviour. I guess the short answer is insecurity. She's an insecure person. And do you think there would be enough money in the universe to make a person like Gina Rinehart feel secure? You look at the family history, you look at the family dynamics. It's not just poor people who pass on intergenerational trauma. The super rich do that all the time. You look at the shit show of the Murdochs eating each other alive. Rupert Murdoch will still be eating his children when he's in the grave. Look at the Packers. So, yeah, I think the simple answer, and it's only a punt, but I think it's a reasonably educated punt, is insecurity. This is a lonely, insecure person who will never live up to the conception, unrealistic, I suspect, conception that she had of her father and his expectations of her. And it's also just what happens when you grow up in the Iron Dome of cruel privilege. And in that sense, I feel sad and sorry for her. I feel sadder and sorrier for the people who will be subject to what comes out of that history. And I think that might be millions of people, not just a small collection of people who are employed or happen to be neighbours or whatever it is, It's sad, but we've seen this story before. I mean, this is Citizen Kane. There are figures from the Old Testament. There are figures from Homer, probably the Icelandic sagas. This is not a new phenomenon. You can change the uniforms, you can change the time stamp. This is an ancient story.
When you talk about the cruelty of privilege, what do you mean by that?
You can see the transactional psychology that they are possessed of and which they deploy on their children. And Murdoch's a classic example. I'm sure he's capable of love, but that is largely, it would seem, expressed in transactional machinations. And you could probably say that about Kerry Packer and I think you can say that about Lang Hancock. Having lots of money doesn't solve all your problems, and sometimes the way that you make it and the way that you maintain it and consolidate it and thirst for more means that it's not just your employees or the native population or the ordinary punters in your way, become problems that you have to find transactional solutions for. It's the people closest to you, also need to be controlled. And if not made in your image, then somehow dominated. And those kids are traumatized. History is full of lost, rich kids who kill themselves, in their 30s and 40s and 50s and even in their 60s because they've never overcome the trauma of being raised by a prince or a queen. Wow, look at that poor, sad ginger fella who lives in Montecito now. He had tragedy in his life, but look at his dad. Poor, sad, emotional lives that these people live, in the Iron Dome of privilege. You'll find more human warmth in a shanty town, in a brick veneer home, in an asbestos shack than you'd find in the penthouse suites or in the armed estates or in the bunkers that they're already building. So there's riches and there's poverty. My hope is that the riches of ordinary working people and their solidarity and their capacity for empathy and their intolerance for bullshit will arm them against the other kinds of riches. That's what I'm fighting to encourage and illuminate and empower so that my grandchildren don't inherit the whirlwind that's been created for them by these callous, poorly educated dolts.
Sorry.
Sorry. Hay fever.
Yeah. I mean, it's also just sort of, the money makes them lose their humanity somehow.
Yeah, no, clearly. And I think that's the sorrow and the pity of it. But yeah, I think it's it is the loss of humanity. You can wear the flash clothes, you can have the limos. It doesn't make you more human, and that's the sad part of the loss of humanity, the loss of empathy. This is the thing that you see, and we're seeing it in the White House. This is a person without empathy, acting almost without restraint now on the world, and his acolytes all over the world, including in Sydney and most painfully in Perth, are empowered by that pitiless lack of empathy and this mistaken idea that riches equal success and virtue, and that being poor is not an outcome of circumstance, it's an expression of character. And this is the mistake these people make. They think they're rich because of their good character. This is the story they tell themselves all day and all night because of their insecurity. Some people have been extremely clever and hardworking and become rich. They'd probably be a little less rich if there was a more just taxation system. So many of these people genuinely think that they have billions and billions and billions of dollars because they are better people, because they are good people.
This series began by examining Gina's support for Donald Trump and her influence on the then opposition leader, Peter Dutton. Now, following the federal election, the playing field looks a little different. But Gina Rinehart refuses to take a backward step. 2 days after the election result, she released an extended statement via the Daily Mail. We've had parts of that read out by a voice actor.
The left media did a very successful effort, frightening many in the Liberal Party from anything Trump and away from any Trump-like policies. No doubt the left media will now try to claim that the Liberal loss was because the Liberal Party followed Trump and became too right. The two simply don't add up. While putting both feet into New York before the USA November election, a known, left-educated, left-voting Democrat area, walking around the rubbish in streets, and more than a little concerned about safety at times, wearing my Trump hat and bag, and more to attract, well, I must admit I did let rotten eggs, tomatoes slip into my mind, but hoping also to attract discussion. And discussion it did. And what do you think those in their late 20s and 30s were telling me? Educated on left propaganda? It's hard to get married because they couldn't afford homes, even rental. They were worried about their future. And what was I hearing from parents with young children? Financially, they were really struggling to cope. These previous young Democrats, brought up in years of left propaganda, miseducation, were becoming Republicans. Why are Americans getting it and we aren't? How attractive are Paris Accord, unreliable electricity, nature-positive plan, big delaying, expensive government tape, big high-cost government, old IR policies that proved unsuccessful for productivity, but successful for strike disruption and unreliability, to attracting investment to underpin our living standards.
Ahead of his election win, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese was clear that the nature-positive reforms were off the table. But he pledged to revisit new environmental laws in this term of Parliament. This move is set to test the power and influence of Gina Rinehart and the mining sector under a majority Labor government.
I don't think anybody's asking for the end of fossil fuels tomorrow. I don't think anybody in West Australia is asking for the end of mining. They're making and prosecuting a false case, but then that's a way of knocking off any kind of moderate or modest reform. The funny thing is that, the fossil fuel industry in particular is already terrified. They know that they're on the nose. They know that their world is ending, and they are in a position of enormous cultural power. They buy that power constantly. Their logos smother every aspect of our lives. And yet, if any tiny, sometimes ineffectual, well, most often very modest bleatings of reservation or resistance about their activities produces such a disproportionate overreaction to the point where their fear just becomes so obvious. They are terrified. So it's a strange, topsy-turvy world. And I guess it's a microcosm of what's happening in Australia in terms of our polity anyway, where the influence of billionaires and the CEOs and the C-suites is infinitely more consequential than civil society, non-government organisations, social justice groups, charities, churches, you name it. People feel a level of disheartenment and disillusionment, and increasingly rage, because they see how quick it is for a very, very small elite. I mean, these are the people who rage about elites, of course, but they are the elite. There's a tiny club, and it's the captain's club, and you see them all disappearing behind the glass doors in the airport. These are the people who have the ear instantly, that have access that you and I would never have, and our parents and our cousins and our neighbours will never have.
A spokesperson for Hancock Prospecting provided us with the following comment, which we've had read out by a voice actor.
This environmental campaigner seems completely out of touch with truth or reality. They appear blind to the fact that Australia's resources sector funds hospitals, emergency services, defence, veterans, elderly, vital infrastructure and more through tens of billions in taxes and royalties each year. The mining sector provides, on average, the highest paying jobs in the country. Without the resources sector, Australia's economy would collapse. Ironically, the very technologies they promote as the answer, ignoring that the so-called renewables cannot provide 24/7 reliable electricity, including solar panels, wind turbines, electric vehicles, batteries, cannot be manufactured or function without multiple mined minerals.
The spokesperson also said that Mrs. Rinehart has, quote,
contributed more to Australians, including in the outback, and our country's sporting successes than all of the negative gossipers combined. Hancock Prospecting is proudly an Australian company and invests heavily in its primary industries, Australian jobs and regional areas. Hancock Prospecting is also Australia's largest private taxpayer and has been so for years. If this so-called environmental campaigner is actually interested in helping Australia, including the Pilbara, he or she should support the industries that provide opportunity and living standards for workers and their families and for the next generation.
I was in the north part of the Indian Ocean last November, and we went to Scott Reef. It's a very long way off the coast, And you just get out there and it's this skyscraper, underwater skyscraper, just rising up from, the abyss. But the moment I jumped out of the boat into the water, I knew something was terribly wrong, And it was just the water temperature. It was reading 35 degrees. So the water was just boiling. We're in the middle of this heat wave. 2 weeks later, Kimberley corals started bleaching. A couple of weeks after that, 30,000 fish died in one event in the Pilbara coast. A couple of weeks after that, Ningaloo Reef started undergoing a kind of bleaching event, which is unprecedented and quite terrifying. And so we're into this world of change. Our bodies are changing. The north is becoming uninsurable in real time.
I will stop because I could talk to you all afternoon, but you've always been so generous with your time.
Thanks, mate. Oh,
sorry, I'm getting emotional.
It's been a long podcast for you. So this is you're nearly done, are you?
Well,
this has been Gina, a podcast about Australia's richest person. But this isn't the end. We are expecting a result in a major court case between a number of parties and involving John Hancock and Gina Rinehart by the end of June. You heard about that in episode 4. We'll also be back in the event of any major updates or breaking news. So please keep subscribing and following wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for listening.
Gina is recorded on Kaurna and Parramac land. It's reported by me, Sarah Martin, and the series producer is Jo Koenig. The executive producer is Shelley Hepworth, and the head of audio is Miles Martignoni. Sound design in this episode was by Jo Koenig.